Consider the following joke. The feature I'm most interested in is skin. I couldn't date a partner without skin. At first, the meaning is clear. The first sentence is processed as a familiar statement of taste, idiosyncratic perhaps, but socially legible. Skin, in this context, is understood as an object of aesthetic attention. The speaker is naming a physical feature they notice or care about, just as someone else might say they're drawn to hands or eyes or voice. It may read as a bit superficial, but it's not strange. The internal logic is intact. Skin is associated with physical appeal, and physical appeal is a common precursor to romantic attraction. In the background, the mind forms a tidy causal structure, what we can more precisely describe as a triad. This triadic frame begins with an object, skin, understood as a visual or tactile preference. That preference generates attraction. Attraction, in turn, generates interest in a romantic or sexual partner. The structure is sequential and intuitive. Skin leads to attraction, and attraction leads to desire. There's no disruption in this reading. In fact, the listener barely notices that they've constructed a small logical system. The coherence of the statement makes the reasoning feel effortless. Then comes the second sentence, I couldn't date a partner without skin. On first hearing, it seems to follow naturally from the first, as if the speaker is about to elaborate on or reinforce their preference. But something shifts midstream. The phrase, without skin, introduces a possibility that hadn't even been considered. A partner, not with undesirable skin, but with none at all. This isn't just a matter of poor complexion or lack of appeal. It presents an anatomical impossibility, something off the scale of normal human variation. And that, not the change in tone or content, is what triggers the disturbance. The mind, still operating within the original frame of romantic preference, suddenly encounters a data point that doesn't fit. It's not that the statement contradicts the earlier logic, it's that it refuses to belong to the same system at all. At this point, the listener experiences a kind of interpretive dissonance. The frame they had unconsciously adopted, one in which skin was an aesthetic object among many, is no longer sufficient. The introduction of a skinless partner doesn't just disrupt the spectrum of romantic taste, it renders it irrelevant. Skin, which moments ago denoted a subtle and perhaps even refined physical preference, now appears as a basic anatomical prerequisite. The object remains the same, but the conditions of interpretation shift. We are no longer talking about variations in attractiveness. We are now talking about viability, embodiment, and the bare conditions for human presence. This shift forces the listener to reprocess the first sentence. The logic hasn't been contradicted, but the interpretive frame has been invalidated. The earlier reading, where I like skin meant I'm attracted to it, no longer holds. It now sounds like a grotesque understatement, the kind of thing someone would say not to express taste, but to confirm that they require their partners to have skin at all. The phrasing, once taken as romantic or even a little poetic, collapses into absurdity. The elegance of the original statement is revealed as a setup. Its tone was misleading, and it's only in light of the second sentence that this becomes clear. The joke functions by retroactively distorting what had seemed like a coherent premise, forcing the listener to abandon the original frame and adopt a new one entirely. What makes the joke funny is not simply that it presents an absurd scenario. Absurdity alone is cheap. It doesn't account for the structure that makes the humor land. What actually produces the laugh is the timing and sequence of reinterpretation. Each sentence on its own makes sense. The first constructs a coherent triadic frame based on subjective preference, skin as a feature of aesthetic interest. The second introduces a different frame altogether, one that treats skin not as a preference but as a baseline condition for personhood. Both interpretations are internally valid, but they operate in incompatible registers. They cannot both be true in the same frame of reference. The object skin functions as a pivot, not because its meaning changes outright, but because the conditions under which it is evaluated shift completely. The listener's task is not to spot a contradiction, but to reconcile the two frames by abandoning one in favor of the other. That reconciliation isn't immediate. The humor is delayed precisely because the mind needs a moment to recognize what has happened. The second sentence doesn't offer contradiction or clarification. It creates interpretive failure. The listener senses that something has gone wrong, that their initial reading no longer fits, but they do not yet know why. What follows is a moment of mental backtracking. The listener reevaluates the original sentence in light of the second, only to realize that the frame they had adopted was too narrow. It wasn't wrong, strictly speaking, it was just incomplete. The reversion occurs when the listener reconstructs the joke under a new frame, one in which skin now means something entirely different, and the first sentence retroactively collapses under the weight of that redefinition. The laugh is the result of that resolution. It marks the precise point at which reinterpretation succeeds and a new coherence emerges. Understanding this process gives us a useful model for how certain types of humor work. In the case of this joke, the laugh is not a response to contradiction, but to interpretive reordering. The joke operates by first establishing a logical frame that the audience unconsciously accepts. It then introduces a second frame that shares one key term with the first, but uses it in a fundamentally different way. The result is a retrospective inversion. The second frame forces the listener to go back and revise their understanding of the first. What was once coherent is now recontextualized. The original interpretation is no longer tenable. The listener has to abandon it and adopt the new frame instead. This process, establishing a valid frame, introducing an incompatible one, and then triggering reversion, is a general mechanism that underlies a whole class of jokes. We might call it triadic inversion through shared object. Its defining characteristic is not contradiction but reversibility. The two interpretations are not mutually exclusive in logic. They are exclusive in framing. Both are coherent, but they produce meaning in different contexts. The tension arises from the listener's initial commitment to one interpretation, and the resolution comes from their ability to discard it in favor of another. The laughter in this case is the release that follows a successful cognitive pivot. What this reveals is that humor, at least of this sort, is not irrational. It is, in fact, the product of careful logical architecture. It engages the mind not by defying coherence, but by manipulating it. The joke works because it offers the listener a temporary illusion of stability, only to revoke it in a way that demands reanalysis. The pleasure is not in the confusion, but in the clarity that follows it. This kind of structure is not confined to humor. It appears in irony and double meanings, in philosophical reversals, and in any context where a single object carries conflicting roles across different interpretive systems. What makes humor unique is that it resolves the conflict through laughter, a signal not of misunderstanding, but of recognition. It marks the moment when we realize we were wrong, but the cost of being wrong is light, and the recovery is swift. In the end, the laughter doesn't come from what's said, it comes from what we thought it meant, before we knew better.